The faint chime of crystal glasses echoed like a symphony in the dimly lit expanse of ambrosia, Beverly Hills' crown jewel of indulgence. Conversations hummed softly, weaving through the air like silk threads, while candlelight danced across polished silverware, casting fleeting shadows that whispered of opulence. Every corner of the room was steeped in luxury, the kind that didn't just speak but commanded attention. For most patrons, this wasn't merely a restaurant, it was a temple where status mingled with taste, and every detail reinforced their place within its gilded hierarchy. And then, he walked in. Desmond. A man who seemed, at first glance, to belong elsewhere, or perhaps nowhere at all within these hallowed walls. Tall, broad-shouldered, and radiating quiet strength, Desmond carried himself with an unassuming grace. His navy sweater hugged his frame neatly, paired with pressed jeans and polished leather shoes. Simple. Understated. Not unkempt by any means, but certainly not adorned with the designer labels or glittering jewels that adorned others in the room. The contrast was stark enough to ripple through the dining hall like a stone dropped into still water. Eyes flicked toward him, some curious, some dismissive. Whispers fluttered behind manicured hands, smiles barely concealing disdain. Did he notice? Perhaps. But if he did, he gave no sign. With measured steps and an aura of calm assurance, Desmond approached the host's stand. "Reservation for Desmond," he said, his voice steady, unwavering. The young host hesitated, his practiced smile faltering ever so slightly as his gaze swept over Desmond's attire. Was this man truly here? Or had there been some mistake? But professionalism won out, masking his doubt beneath a veneer of courtesy. Of course. Right this way. He gestured smoothly, leading Desmond past tables draped in pristine white linens toward a secluded corner near the towering windows. Beyond the glass, the city lights shimmered like scattered diamonds, oblivious to the undercurrents swirling inside. As Desmond settled into his seat, he took in the scene around him, the glint of gold cufflinks catching the light, the elegant swirl of wine in crystal goblets, the almost imperceptible nod of approval exchanged between diners. It was beautiful, yes, but also suffocating. There was an invisible weight pressing down on the room, an unspoken code dictating who belonged and who didn't. And though Desmond felt the lingering stares, the subtle judgments, he remained unfazed. Unfolding the menu with deliberate care, he scanned the offerings without hesitation, without even a glance at the prices. But while Desmond appeared unperturbed, his server was another story altogether. Bryce arrived at the table with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Impeccably dressed, every movement calculated, he exuded polish, but there was something brittle about his demeanor, something sharp lurking beneath the surface. "Good evening, sir," Bryce began, his tone laced with a politeness reserved for those he deemed beneath him. "Can I get you started with water? We have sparkling, still, or tap." Desmond looked up, meeting Bryce's gaze with a calmness that bordered on indifference. "Still water, please." His voice carried no trace of defensiveness, no hint of self-consciousness. Bryce nodded, jotting down the request, though the faint twitch of his lips betrayed his thoughts. He disappeared momentarily, leaving Desmond to observe the room. Nearby, a couple leaned closer, whispering behind raised menus. Their eyes darted toward him, then quickly away when Desmond caught them. When Bryce returned, setting the bottle and glass on the table with mechanical precision, he asked, "Have you had the chance to look at the menu yet?" "Yes," Desmond replied without missing a beat. Folding the menu closed, he handed it back. "I'll start with the black truffle risotto, followed by the Wagyu tenderloin." No hesitation. No second-guessing. Bryce blinked, caught off guard. He had expected, well, something simpler, perhaps. Something less extravagant. But Desmond's choices left no room for assumptions. "Excellent choice, sir," Bryce said, though the words felt hollow, mismatched against the edge in his tone. As he walked away, he glanced back once, curiosity warring with judgment in his expression. The tension grew thicker with each passing moment. When Bryce brought the appetizer, placing it on the table with practiced flair, his demeanor remained clipped. "Enjoy," he muttered before retreating swiftly. Desmond noticed, of course, he noticed everything, but he chose not to react. Instead, he picked up his fork, savoring the risotto with slow, deliberate bites. It was exquisite, as one would expect from such a place. Yet the atmosphere soured the experience, leaving a bitter aftertaste. Snippets of conversation drifted toward him, fragments of whispers meant to be discreet but not discreet enough. He doesn't look like he belongs here, a woman murmured at the adjacent table, her companion chuckling softly in agreement. Their voices were low, calculated to avoid detection, but not low enough to escape Desmond's ears. Bryce's behavior grew bolder, more pointed, as the evening wore on. By the time the main course arrived, the mood at Desmond's table had become almost tangible, charged with unspoken tension. Bryce set the plate down with exaggerated care, leaning in slightly as he spoke. "Your Wagyu tenderloin, sir. I trust you'll find it worth the price." His eyes flicked meaningfully toward Desmond's sweater, the implication clear. This wasn't about the dish at all. Desmond met his gaze head-on, cutting into the steak with precise movements. "Thank you," he said simply, his tone betraying nothing. If anything, his composure only seemed to irritate Bryce further, who lingered longer than necessary before walking away. Across the room, a middle-aged man leaned back in his chair, openly staring, as if trying to solve some riddle etched into Desmond's presence. It was as though Desmond sat at the center of a storm, a strange calm surrounded by swirling judgment. When Bryce returned with the dessert menu, slapping it onto the table with an audible thud, his forced smile slipped for just a second. "Might I suggest something from our dessert selection? Perhaps the sorbet, it's light." Desmond raised an eyebrow, a flicker of amusement crossing his face. "Actually, I'll have the Grand Marnier soufflé." Handing the menu back, his calmness seemed to gnaw at Bryce, who nodded stiffly before retreating. At the service station, Bryce whispered something to a colleague, their laughter barely muffled as they both glanced in Desmond's direction. This was a new territory for Desmond. He'd seen it before, the narrative spun silently around him, one that bore little resemblance to reality. Minutes later, the soufflé arrived, placed on the table with the same rehearsed elegance. "Bon appetit," Bryce said, his tone clipped, before stepping back. Desmond savored the dessert slowly, letting the tension in the room build until it felt almost electric. He could feel the weight of the stares, the undercurrent of disdain rippling through the space. But he refused to let it break him. Not here. Not now. And then, the atmosphere shifted entirely. A man in a tailored suit approached Desmond's table, his salt and pepper hair framing a face marked by authority and ease. Smiling warmly, he extended his hand. "Desmond, I didn't know you were in town." The room seemed to freeze, holding its collective breath. Desmond stood, shaking the man's hand firmly. "Good to see you, Charles," he replied, his voice steady as ever. The two exchanged pleasantries, their conversation casual yet threaded with familiarity. Bryce, who had been hovering nearby, froze mid-step, his smug confidence crumbling into visible unease. This was the moment when the truth began to unravel, and the restaurant's hierarchy prepared to flip on its head. Desmond leaned back slightly, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "It's been smooth so far," he said, his voice calm and measured. "We're focusing on maintaining the integrity of the brand while bringing in some fresh perspectives." The words hung in the air like the crack of thunder after a silent storm. Conversations paused mid-sentence, forks hovered above plates as diners exchanged glances, their curiosity piqued. Nearby, Bryce, who had been pretending to polish a wineglass with meticulous care, visibly faltered. His head snapped toward the table, eyes narrowing as if trying to decipher an impossible riddle. What had he just heard? Charles, seated across from Desmond, smiled broadly, gesturing expansively around the room. "This place has been thriving under your leadership," he said warmly. "The team speaks highly of your vision." Desmond inclined his head modestly, brushing off the praise. "It's a group effort. I'm lucky to have such a dedicated staff." But the murmurs began almost immediately. Realization rippled through the dining room like a wave breaking against the shore. Desmond wasn't just any diner. He was the owner of the restaurant. Suddenly, Bryce's earlier comments, his dismissive attitude, it all carried a weight that hadn't been there before. It wasn't mere rudeness anymore. It was a glaring mistake. Bryce approached hesitantly, his usual swagger replaced by something closer to panic. His posture sagged, and the practiced smile he wore like armor had vanished. "Is there anything else I can get for you, sir?" he asked, his voice strained, barely concealing his unease. Desmond looked up, his expression calm but firm. "No, thank you. Everything has been illuminating." His tone carried an unspoken meaning that made Bryce's face pale several shades. Charles, noticing the tension thickening the air, decided to intervene. Leaning forward slightly, he addressed Bryce directly. "Bryce, isn't it? You've been taking care of us tonight? Yes, sir, Bryce stammered, his composure completely shattered. I hope everything has been to your satisfaction. Desmond paused, holding Bryce's gaze for a moment longer than necessary. Then, with a slight nod, he said, I'll have some thoughts to share later. Bryce nodded rapidly, retreating like a man narrowly escaping a storm. But the storm wasn't over yet. It was simply waiting to make its final impression. As Bryce disappeared into the background, the atmosphere in the restaurant transformed entirely. Conversations that had once buzzed with judgmental whispers were now hushed with embarrassment. Desmond's presence no longer felt like an anomaly, it commanded respect. Charles stayed for a few more minutes, chatting warmly with Desmond before excusing himself. I'll let you enjoy the rest of your evening, he said, shaking Desmond's hand firmly. But let's catch up soon. With Charles gone, Desmond returned to his seat, casually taking a sip of water. The once icy room now felt distinctly warmer, though it was clear some diners still didn't know how to act. The couple at the next table, who had earlier whispered about Desmond not belonging, now avoided eye contact entirely. Their earlier smirks had dissolved into awkward silence. Bryce reappeared a few minutes later, his demeanor completely altered. Gone was the cocky server who had subtly sneered and undermined Desmond all evening. In his place stood a nervous man, visibly shaken, as if he'd just realized the ground beneath him was far shakier than he'd assumed. I wanted to apologize, sir, Bryce said, his voice barely above a whisper. If there was anything I said or did that came across as disrespectful, I sincerely regret it. Desmond studied Bryce for a long moment, letting the weight of his silence settle between them. Finally, he spoke. It's not just about what you said, Bryce. It's about how you saw me. How you decided who I was before knowing anything about me. Bryce's face flushed red, and he nodded quickly, fumbling for words. I didn't mean to, Desmond held up a hand, cutting him off gently but firmly. The lesson here isn't for me to teach you tonight, Bryce. It's something you'll have to reflect on yourself. He paused, his voice softening. But let me say this, treating people with respect, no matter how they look, will take you much further than assuming who they are. Bryce looked down, his hands twisting nervously in front of him. I understand, sir. Thank you. Desmond nodded, signaling the end of the conversation. Bryce retreated once again, this time with a lesson etched clearly into his mind. As the evening drew to a close, Desmond requested the check. The restaurant manager, who had caught wind of the situation, rushed over with it personally. Mr. Desmond, it's truly an honor to have you here tonight, she said, her voice dripping with sincerity. Your meal is, of course, on the house. Desmond gave a small smile but shook his head. I appreciate the gesture, but I believe in paying for what I enjoy. The manager nodded, understanding, and stepped back as Desmond signed the bill and left a generous tip, more than enough to remind Bryce of what dignity and kindness look like in practice. As Desmond stood to leave, the room seemed to hold its collective breath. He walked out with the same quiet confidence he'd entered with, leaving behind a lesson that lingered far longer than his presence. Some lessons don't require loud declarations or grand gestures. They're taught in the quiet moments, in the spaces where actions speak louder than words. Outside Ambrosia, the cool evening air greeted Desmond. The faint hum of traffic and distant laughter from the streets created a stark contrast to the silence he had left behind in the restaurant. He paused for a moment, looking back at the glowing windows of the establishment. Inside, it was likely that conversations were already shifting, some reflecting on the evening's events, others avoiding them altogether. But the lesson, Desmond knew, would linger for those who chose to see it. Respect, like kindness, doesn't cost a thing. Yet it holds the power to transform the way we see each other, breaking through assumptions and prejudices. What happened that night at the restaurant wasn't just about one man's treatment. It was a reminder of something greater, a call to challenge our biases and lead with humanity. Desmond's story is a testament to grace under fire, to the strength it takes to remain dignified in the face of disrespect. He didn't need to raise his voice or demand retribution to make an impact. Instead, his quiet resilience and measured words left an impression far deeper than any argument could. So, the next time you find yourself in a situation where judgment creeps in, ask yourself, what story are you creating about someone you don't even know? And more importantly, how would you feel if you were on the receiving end of that same story? Let Desmond's experience be a lesson to us all, a reminder to treat others as we would want to be treated, not for who we think they are, but for who they truly might be.